I'm Mr. Beat. I'm here in front of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. It's one of 12 Federal Reserve banks, all in charge of monetary policy here in the United States. These banks make up the Federal Reserve System, aka the Fed, or the central banking system of the United States. Their purpose? Okay, well, there are two main objectives of the Federal Reserve System. Number one, maximizing employment. Basically making sure as many people are earning money as possible. And number two, keeping prices stable. Basically making sure inflation doesn't get that out of control so that we can all afford to buy stuff. Inflation is the general increase of prices across all markets. Now, the Fed has other goals. For example, it has a goal of moderating long-term interest rates, and it does other stuff like regulate banks and provide financial services to banks that deposit money. The bottom line is, though, the Fed wants economic stability. It doesn't want the economy to get too crazy, because when that happens, it leads to a recession. A recession is a sustained period of an economy shrinking. In a recession, economic activities stop happening as much. Less people spend money. Less people hire others to do work for them. Now, keep in mind that different people have different definitions of what a, quote, recession is. That all said, many economists say a recession has officially happened when there is at least 2 consecutive quarters of the economy shrinking. In other words, a recession is officially happening if the economy is not growing for at least 6 straight months, okay? Okay? Now, what's the difference between a recession and a depression? Meh. A depression is basically just a really bad recession. In particular, a recession that drags on and in which unemployment is particularly high. Anyway, back to the Fed and economic stability. While the Fed has always tried to keep the economy stable, it has rarely been easy. And often, the Fed has failed. In fact, some economists even argue that the Fed has played a significant role causing recessions. Holy crap. However, the Federal Reserve System has only been around for 109 years. So don't worry, there were others to blame before it existed. In this video, let's look at every recession and depression in American history. It's gonna be so depressing and recessioning. Wait, that's not a word, is it? And I'll go through the causes and effects of each one. Okay, let's do this. Come on, let's go. Woot woot. Come on. The Panic of 1785. This recession lasted from 1785 to 1788, actually, and it followed an economic boom caused by the American War of Independence. After the war ended, there was dramatic deflation, meaning there was a general decrease in the prices of goods and services across most markets. Oh, that sounds great! You know, since stuff was way cheaper, right? Wrong. Deflation meant less investment since less people were willing to spend their money because they were scared that if they spent it too soon, they might miss out on lower prices. Therefore, Americans in the mid-1780s were making less money. Meanwhile, it seemed that every government within the country was in debt, and it became harder to borrow money. Not only that, different states had different currencies, and trade went down with foreign countries. Americans became so desperate that it led to political unrest, for crying out loud, as demonstrated by Shays' Rebellion. One of the very first videos I made for this channel was about Shays' Rebellion. And it's still pretty up to date, as it turns out, since, you know, our interpretations of history don't change that quickly.
I'd argue that without the Panic of 1785, the Constitutional Convention never would have happened. The Copper Panic of 1789, caused by people circulating fake copper coins after the American War of Independence. This one was much less severe and quicker. Still, these copper counterfeiters caused the real value of copper to tank. In response, the Bank of Philadelphia saved the day by creating paper money to replace the copper coins, thus creating what's known as, quote, fiat money, or money issued by a government, not actually backed up by a physical commodity.
You know, like copper. Oh, and a commodity is any resource that markets treat equally no matter where the resource came from. You know, like if copper came from my butt, it would be valued the same as if it came from anywhere else. Copper could come from my butt and still be worth the same. All right, maybe not.
Anyway, 2 years later, the federal government created its first national bank, simply called the First Bank of the United States. That's a boring name. It was basically there to lend money to the federal government, and folks like Alexander Hamilton called for it to create economic stability. Well, that economic stability lasted for 6 years. The Panic of 1796 to 1797.
Noticing a theme here? Yeah, it used to be more trendy, I guess, with historians to call a recession a panic. Anyway.
The Panic of 1796 to 1797. Another one caused by deflation, and the deflation this time came from the Bank of England, actually. Long story, very short. The Bank of England was struggling to fund all the wars Britain was fighting against France. Due to this, it led to a financial crisis, not just across Britain, but all across Europe, and yep, the United States. Real estate markets in particular struggled as many couldn't pay off their loans after an investment bubble burst.
Oh, an economic bubble is a period when stuff is way overvalued, aka way overinflated, like a bubble, and then prices crash. And yes, all bubbles burst. You don't have no magical bubble on you.
In fact, this economic crisis led to Congress suspending its loan payments to France from what they owed from the American War of Independence. In response, this led to France seizing American ships trading with Britain, and then what's known as the Quasi-War, an unofficial naval war with France.
That all said, the American South survived this recession quite well.
The 1802 to 1804 recession.
So now we're calling them recessions. Okay.
This one, indeed, lasted from 1802 to 1804, and once again, it was Britain and France to blame.
They stopped going to war with each other? How dare they?
Yep, the two countries temporarily stopped fighting each other in 1802, which led to commodity prices significantly falling. The Depression of 1807.
Oh, so now we're depressed.
Due mainly to the British Royal Navy kidnapping American sailors and forcing them to serve on British ships in something called impressment, Congress passed and President Thomas Jefferson signed the infamous Embargo Act of 1807, which stopped American ships from trading in foreign ports. Well, the law led to a 3-year recession. Well, right, I guess it was bad enough to call it a depression. Anyway, as you might assume, the trade restrictions hurt shipping-related industries the worst. With trading way down, hardly anyone in New England was making money.
The Depression was so bad that it led to a lot of Americans turning against President Jefferson in particular.
The 1812 recession. This time caused by international trade restrictions, this one lasted only about 6 months. Many historians say it ended so quickly due to production going way up in response to the outbreak of the War of 1812. The 1815 to 1821 Depression. Well, all good things come to an end. Bad things. After the War of 1812 ended, inflation skyrocketed, and this happened due to a boom in the burgeoning textile industry in not just the United States, but also Britain. Wages couldn't keep up with prices, man. Not only that, Britain passed a tariff, or tax on imports, which further increased prices.
This went on for like 4 years.
And then the most devastating economic crisis in American history up to that point. So what caused it? Well, mainly too much fiat money being created in response to too much speculation on lands sold by the government. This created an economic bubble that burst in, you guessed it, 1819. This led to really high unemployment. Although today we don't know exactly how bad unemployment was back then. It also led to bank failures, which in turn led to bank runs, in which customers ran to banks to withdraw all their money before the banks failed, which in turn led to more bank failures. And finally, the Panic of 1819 led to widespread foreclosures, or the process of a bank taking over a home because the homeowner isn't paying back the money they owed on the house to that bank.
After the 1815 to 1821 Depression, the country only barely survived before then falling into 3 more small recessions throughout the 1820s.
The 1822 to 1823 recession, caused by commodity prices dropping once again. This one led to high unemployment and screwed up the trade balance. The 1825 to 1826 recession. This one was caused by the Panic of 1825, basically another bubble bursting. That bubble, a bunch of speculative investments across Latin America, including investments in an imaginary country called Poyeyes. A general and con artist named Gregor MacGregor, what a name that is, tricked a bunch of British and French investors to buy up land in Poyeyes, which, didn't exist. The 1828 to 1829 recession, another one caused by a trade embargo. This time, England said its colonies couldn't trade with the United States, and the resulting decline of trade, combined with it becoming much more difficult to borrow money, led to this recession lasting around 1 year.
Boy, the 1820s were not roaring.
The 1833 to 1834 recession. This one was short and caused by too much land speculation. The 1836 to 1838 recession. After 2 years of dramatic economic growth, the federal government, under President Andrew Jackson's leadership, devalued the US dollar. Then a bunch of people sought after both gold and silver. In response to this, banks printed even more fiat money. Between 1834 and 1836, the money supply in the United States grew by 30%. Meanwhile, Jackson was determined to defeat the National Bank, which by this time was the second bank of the United States. And it wasn't just Jackson. A bunch of Americans by this time were like, a central bank is not bussin'. After the passage of the Deposit Act of 1836, Jackson forced the second bank of the United States to give up $10 million and disperse all that money among state banks, yo. Not only that, he later gave an executive order that said federal land had to be bought with silver or gold, not fiat money. Based on those two actions, many historians have argued Jackson played a big freaking role causing the 1836 to 1838 recession.
It was a tale as old as time. Before the recession, banks lent out money like it wasn't no thing, and it was all unregulated.
New banks opened, times were good, but a new bubble formed around real estate, specifically speculation on lands, once again sold by the government. That bubble burst in 1837 in what's today known as the Panic of 1837. And And thanks in part to Jackson dispersing the national bank's deposits among state banks, deposits fell in banks that needed those deposits the most. More than 600 banks failed, and no part of the country did not feel the effect of this. The Panic of 1837 also caused the cotton market to collapse throughout the South. By the 1840s, the Second Bank of the United States was meh, and the recessions continued. The late 1839 to late 1843 recession.
Okay, what kind of name is that?
Caused by banks all of a sudden now being too conservative and not loaning out enough money, it led to some of the most severe deflation in American history. Investors were simply too scared, and for 4 straight years, economic growth was stagnant. The 1847 to 1848 recession, caused by the end of the railroad industry boom, which originated in, you guessed it, Great Britain. This recession featured stock markets crashing, prices falling, and less money being loaned out. That said, the California gold rush quickly ended this recession, ultimately adding more than $2 billion in gold to the American economy alone. The 1853 to 1854 recession. Meh, this one wasn't nearly as bad as most recessions in American history. Caused by banks raising interest rates, it did lead to a big decrease in railroad investments.
The next one was a much bigger deal, though.
The Panic of 1857, and it was caused by too much investments in railroads. Go figure. Specifically, the Panic of 1857 began when the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company failed. This triggered lots of fear, and for the first time in history, the fear spread quickly via a new invention called the telegraph. Once again, even though it wasn't rational, Americans lost confidence in banks. They freaked out.
And many American history dorks like myself often forget that the Panic of 1857 was indeed a major cause of the American Civil War.
The 1860 to 1861 recession, but this recession doesn't get blamed for the Civil War, likely because it was only mild. The reason why? The 1860 to 1861 recession saw the first time clearinghouses, or third parties stepping in to make sure deals go through, stepped in to make sure banks honored trades. During the American Civil War, Congress passed the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864, which returned a system of national banks to the country with the U.S. national banking system. This finally helped banking become more consistent across the country. The 1865 to 1867 recession, this was another one caused by a war ending.
We really ought to think about keeping wars going on forever and ever, for the economy.
Anyway, bad deflation happened after the war.
And this deflation happened for the next 2 decades. No big deal. No big deal.
The 1865 to 1867 recession was caused by production difficulties after the war, as so much needed to be rebuilt and less resources were available. The American South was particularly hit hard. In response, many white men began making deals with African American sharecroppers, effectively continuing slave labor even though slavery was now illegal. The 1869 to 1870 recession. This was a weird one. It happened during a particularly prosperous time in the railroad industry and when farmers were mostly doing just fine. However, many economists say what caused the 1869 to 1870 recession was the same thing that caused the 1865 to 1867 recession. It was hard to produce stuff due to a lack of resources. And now it's time for the original Great Depression, man. Not that Great Depression of the 1930s that you're all familiar with. The Long Depression. Yeah, it was originally called the Great Depression before the, Great Depression happened. Quote, Long Depression is a much more appropriate term, though, since it was technically the longest depression in American history, lasting from 1873 all the way to 1896. Goodness, that's crazy time. It all started with the Panic of 1873, a huge financial panic caused by a number of factors, including the largest bank in the country, J. Cook and Company, failing after spending way more money than it actually had building the Northern Pacific Railway. But it wasn't just J. Cook and Company. Tons of banks over-invested, leading to more bank failures and bank runs.
Not only that, there were fires, like literal fires.
Many economists argue that both the Great Chicago Fire and Great Boston Fire played a role causing the panic. Not only that, Germany stopped minting silver coins. For the next 23 years, any economic recovery was short-lived. Deflation was consistently a problem, and people generally didn't trust banks. It was capped by the Panic of 1893, caused by not only bank failures, but crop failures, and even President Benjamin Harrison's stubborn support for tariffs. The Long Depression was a major cause of first the populist movement and then the entire progressive era, that period of widespread reform and activism between the 1890s and 1920s. After this, the federal government would get more and more and more involved with the economy, beginning with stuff like controlling monopolies and passing laws to protect consumers.
Oh, a monopoly is when a single seller dominates a market.
The 1902 to 1904 recession, caused by the Panic of 1901, which followed the first stock market crash ever on the New York Stock Exchange, insecurity in the railroad industry, and even the assassination of William McKinley. This recession lasted nearly 2 years. The Panic of 1907. This one was fairly mild, but hey, look at this dramatic picture. Once again, the New York Stock Exchange tanked, a bunch of banks failed, and more bank runs happened. Most economists say this one started when investors bought up too many stocks of the United Copper Company. This one would have probably been much worse if not for the efforts of J.P. Morgan, a super rich dude who organized a bunch of financiers like himself to literally bail out banks. In fact, Morgan famously pledged quite a bit of his own money.
The fact that a small number of rich dudes had to bail out the federal government and save the country's economy was kind of a wake-up call to the federal government. After this, there was much more of a national dialogue about having just one central banking system.
The Panic of 1910 to 1911. Now that the Sherman Antitrust Act was being enforced by President William Howard Taft's administration, aimed at curbing monopolies, this actually led to a market panic and stock markets tanked. This recession featured a return to consistent deflation. Meanwhile, Congress had been attempting to create a third central bank. Long story short, in 1910, 6 wealthy and powerful men secretly met on a secluded island off the coast of Georgia to create the Federal Reserve System.
Yeah, I know. I understand why there are conspiracy theories about the Fed, okay? Like, you have this secret group of rich and powerful people all meeting to create arguably the most powerful institution the world has ever seen. Yeah, I get it. But it's important to note that many economists were also on board. Heck, many Americans were on board with it. They were tired of financial panics. Speaking of which,
the recession of 1913 to 1914, caused by World War I beginning.
So I guess wars aren't good for the economy.
This one lasted about 2 years.
Congress passed and President Woodrow Wilson signed into law on December 23rd, 1913, the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve System, and the Fed has prevented recessions and depressions ever since.
Just kidding. Heck, a recession happened just 5 years later, the Post-World War I Recession. This one was worldwide, quick but severe, caused by overproduction throughout North America
And the Spanish flu pandemic.
It led to hyperinflation and high unemployment in Europe, which unfortunately led to a rise of fascism there. The Depression of 1920 to 1921.
Yeah, this one wasn't a depression at all.
It was a short recession, but 1920 was pretty painful for a lot of Americans. In fact, that was the most deflationary year in American history. Prices tanked and hardly anyone was making money.
The next one was a depression, though. In fact, it was the Great Depression. The real one.
The Great Depression. Not only was the Great Depression the worst global economic crisis in American history, it was the worst global economic crisis in modern world history, lasting from 1929 to around 1939, but maybe longer. It had devastating effects. International trade declined by more than 65%. A third of all banks failed. Economic output went down by 25%. Unemployment in the United States got as high as 25% and even as high as 33% in other countries. Housing prices went down 67%. Tens of millions of people lost all of their wealth. Literally all of it.
And what caused it? Well, here are all the causes of the Great Depression, according to economists. But if you want to watch a video where I count down the top 5 causes of the Great Depression, check out my video about that here. Yeah, it's a depressing countdown.
Most economists say it only truly ended because of all the production created during World War II, the deadliest war in history.
And then the war just had to end, causing yet another recession.
The recession of 1945. Yeah, a decline in government spending at the end of the war mainly led to this one. Not only that, there was just this huge transition with all these soldiers coming home that led to production stalling for about 8 months. The recession of 1949. This was a mild recession, actually mainly caused by the Federal Reserve deciding to shrink the money supply.
It ended when the federal government ramped up spending on, you guessed it, war again.
The Korean War, to be specific. The recession of 1953. And this one happened in part because the Korean War ended,
but also because the Federal Reserve decided to shrink the money supply again.
I should chime in here to say that, generally speaking, the American economy dramatically grew from 1945 all the way to the early 1970s, leading to a standard of living dramatically higher than at any point prior in American history. In fact, it was during this time that the, quote, middle class even became a well-recognized thing. Still, mild recessions continued to happen every few years. The recession of 1958 caused by a worldwide economic downturn. This one only lasted about 8 months. The recession of 1960 to 1961, caused by the Federal Reserve once again shrinking the money supply. This one was also fairly quick. The recession of 1969 to 1970, caused by the Federal Reserve once again shrinking the money supply. This one was also fairly quick.
Okay, like I said earlier, during the 1970s, things got much more serious again, thanks to stagflation, which is one of the worst things to ever happen to a society.
The 1973 to 1975 recession. Stagflation is a combination of a stagnant economy marked by high unemployment and high inflation. And that about summed up the 1973 to 1975 recession. It was caused by the 1973 oil crisis, when basically a bunch of Arab countries stopped selling oil to the United States and other countries, leading not only to the price of oil skyrocketing, but also oil shortages. And at the time, the United States and much of the world really depended on oil. This then led to a stock market crash, and the American economy wouldn't truly recover until the mid-1980s. The 1980 recession, caused by another oil shortage in 1979, but also because a new chairman of the Federal Reserve, a dude by the name of Paul Volcker, was like, we've got to do whatever we can to get rid of inflation. He dramatically raised interest rates, which led to this recession, but also led to the 1981 to 1982 recession. Yep, mainly caused by the Federal Reserve dramatically shrinking the money supply. But the good news for Volcker, it worked. Inflation finally went down in the coming years. Early 1990s recession. This was another mild one, caused by stuff like the savings and loan crisis, when 32% of savings and loans associations failed in the late 1980s, and also a sharp rise in oil prices after Iraq invaded Kuwait.
And then something almost unbelievable. It was my childhood, actually. The American economy grew for 10 years straight. It was the longest period of growth in American history up to that point.
Do you remember the 90s?
Yeah?
You know, people were talking about getting piercings and getting tribal tattoos.
Yeah?
And people were singing about saving the planet and forming bands.
Yeah?
Early 2000s recession. The dream of the 1990s came crashing down thanks to the collapse of the speculative dot-com bubble, a stock market bubble caused by people investing way too much in a bunch of internet stuff. The September 11th attacks also played a role in this recession. Still, the American economy recovered quite quickly from it. Well, here's one that many of you are probably familiar with. I know I was deeply affected by it. The Great Recession. One of the worst recessions in American history.
Heck, it was even one of the greatest recessions in American history. Sorry, I'm just trying to make this more engaging for you.
You can watch The Big Short to find out what caused it, but if you don't feel like watching an amazing film, basically the subprime mortgage crisis that began in 2007 caused it. In the aughts, a bunch of people bought houses who couldn't afford them, and then speculative banks gambled the money they got, and when people couldn't pay back their mortgages, banks began failing. Some of the biggest financial institutions in the country, as a matter of fact, failed. Big names like Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman Brothers, and AIG. Even the car industry tanked. And yes, the stock market sank for years. For the first time in American history, the federal government went crazy bailing everybody out. A $700 billion bank bailout, hundreds of billions for other industries, and even regular citizens.
Many economists say that if it weren't for these bailouts, the Great Recession would have turned into another Great Depression. By late 2009, the economy was already growing again. And I'm pretty sure you also know about this next one, too.
The COVID-19 recession.
COVID-19!
COVID-19!
The only recession in American history single-handedly caused by a pandemic. In April 2020 alone, more than 24 million Americans lost their jobs, and the unemployment rate got all the way up to almost 15%, the highest since the Great Depression. That said, once again, the federal government bailed everyone out. Mostly large corporations, but also ordinary Americans, and the economy quickly recovered. In fact, it recovered a bit too much, leading to massive inflation beginning in 2021.
So that was it. That was every recession and depression in American history. I may be the only person on the entire internet to make a video about this. And you know what? That was depressing.
Because the United States has had the world's biggest economy going back all the way arguably to the 1890s, that means this video kind of also went over every recession and depression in world history since then.
But Mr. Beat, what about the Panic of 1792? You know what? Forget the Panic of 1792. And forget Panic at the Disco. They were an overrated band anyway.
But seriously, obviously historians say there were more recessions than I mentioned. And I'll end this video with these thoughts.
Recessions are pretty much inevitable. I don't think we'll ever fully be able to prevent them.
In fact, we may even be in one right now and not even realize it. At least certain YouTube channels have been telling us that for a while now.
And recessions suck. Like, they really suck. For all of us.
Recessions mean you and I maybe not being able to afford to eat. Recessions mean more people desperate on the streets. Recessions mean more political instability, which often means more chaos, more violence, more wars. And depressions? Heck, depressions are so bad that it has historically led us to turn to fascism as a solution. Yep, if we're desperate enough, we'll often put up with a ruthless dictator as long as we have access to clean drinking water.
And by golly, if it isn't obvious by this point, we must learn about past recessions, not because we can prevent future recessions, because like I said earlier, recessions are pretty much inevitable. We learn about past recessions in order to help us deal with and react to in the right way future recessions. For the love of humanity, we must stop making the same mistakes over and over again. I'm serious.
That is not in your script.
It is in my script. I wrote it in the script. Yes. One thing I didn't mention in this video is because of how we gather economic data, we often don't know that a recession happened until we're already well into the recession. That all said, do you think we're in a recession now? I'm sure some of you think we are. Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, you filthy consumers and producers, you.